Hey guys, and welcome back to my channel. So in this video I'm going to show you how to add seam allowance to a pattern. So what is seam allowance? Well, to simply put it, it's just an extra piece of fabric between your raw edge of your material and your stitch line. So how much do you need and where do you need it? If you want to find out, just keep watching. So I've traced out a simple bodice pattern just to demonstrate how to add the seam allowance. So to start, we're going to need to finish off the dart. So as you can see, the dart is still open at the top. So what we need to do is we need to kind of close this top half, because you're not going to add seam allowance along the sides of the dart. It's going to be all one piece. So you need to add the seam allowance to the top. So to do this, you're going to want to close the dart over first, folding it towards the centre front. So then, taking a tracing wheel, you're going to run it along the shoulder line. So when you unfold the dart, you're going to notice that it's formed a V shape at the top of your dart. And this just means that when you're sewing up your fabric and you close your dart, you're not going to have a big chunk of fabric at the top. It's going to sit nicely into that shoulder seam. Now moving to the centre front of the pattern. Here you're not going to add seam allowance. You only do that if it's part of your design. So if your design has a seam up the front, then go ahead and add seam allowance. Instead of seam allowance, I'm simply going to write fold. This is just going to indicate that the fabric is going to be cut on the fold, so that when you're working with your pattern, you know yourself then that you have to fold your fabric to cut your top out into one whole piece. So at the side seams, I'm simply going to add a 1 centimetre seam allowance. Unless you want to do a French seam, then I'd be adding maybe 1.5 centimetres. Again, seam allowance can be your own choice. If you feel safe for working with 2 centimetres, go with 2 centimetres. I like to stick with 1 just because it just be a lot neater when it's all sewn up. So when you're drawing in the seam allowance, continue your lines out from the pattern and join them to the seam allowance, because it makes it look nicer and it makes it look like a one whole piece. Trust me, it looks a lot cleaner when you've it cut out. So now for the armhole. Again, I always go with a 1 centimetre seam allowance, but remember to always use your rulers when you're adding seam allowance to make sure that the measurements the same the whole way around, because the last thing you need is when you sew up your garments and you don't have the correct seam allowance, and then it becomes completely warped. So at the shoulders, I'm going to go ahead and add a 1 centimetre seam allowance, and then again I'm continuing all those lines from the original pattern to kind of keep it all together. So now for the neck, you actually have a couple of options. If you have a facing in your design, I always like to add 1.5 centimetres to the front of the pattern and then 1 centimetre to the facings. And the reason for that is when you sew the facing and the front together, because of that extra 0.5 centimetres, the front slightly rolls backwards so that you actually don't see your facing or your seam, and it just gives it a really clean finish, and it looks so much nicer when it's done. If you're not adding a seam allowance, I'd simply just add a 1 centimetre allowance just for doing a nice overlocking and then stitching that overlocking down. So at the dart, I'd add a 1 centimetre seam allowance to that little V shape. So the centre back again can have a couple of options. So if your back doesn't have a seam, I'd go ahead and add fold again like you did with the front. But say for example your top had a seam up the back, so then you'd be adding a 1 centimetre seam allowance, or 1.5 if you're doing a French seam. So let's just say that my back had a little zip from the neck down. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to just mark in a notch where my zip is going to end, so that I know when I'm sewing it up, when I get to that point, I have to add my zip. So lastly, we have the hem. Again, this all depends on you and your design. So you can have a 2 centimeter hem if you want to do a simple fold and stitch. But let's just say for design's sake that I have a 4 centimeter hem. So I'm going to add that 4 centimeter to the bottom. So now that's all the seam allowance added, so I'm going to go ahead now and cut out the pattern completely so that you can see it a lot more clearly without all those overdrawn lines, because to be honest it can look a little bit intimidating. And there we have the bodice with the added seam allowance. If you have any questions about adding seam allowance, just leave me a comment down below and I'll do my best to help. So I really hope you found this tutorial helpful. If you did, please hit that thumbs up button because it really helps support my channel. And if you'd like to see more content like this, don't forget to hit the subscribe button and the notification bell so you're notified every time I upload a video. So thank you so much for watching, and I will see you in my next one. Bye guys, and stay safe.